Good evening, everybody. I'm Daniel Batsek, President of Film at Lincoln Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this special event. First, a warm thank you to Rolex, who are the presenting partner of the New York Film Festival. We're really incredibly grateful for that partnership, and it's been an incredibly exciting festival so far. We're just over the halfway mark, and I'm sure, hopefully, a lot of you have been able to see some of the incredible films that we've been showing. It's certainly been great to be around audiences as they line up for films or as they come out of films and chat about them, and this is sort of what this is about as well. The New York Film Festival was so honored that Rebecca Miller chose our festival to premiere this definitive portrait of one of the greatest directors of our time, Martin Scorsese. This year's New York Film Festival has been a bit of a family affair for Rebecca. Her son Ronan's debut film was world premiered here, which starred her husband, Daniel Day-Lewis. So the Miller Day-Lewis family household over the last 3 months, I imagine, had quite a lot of tension in it. But all that has gone away because the films have shown and they've been so well received. And I'm incredibly grateful that we have Rebecca Miller here with a panel. So if I'd like to introduce them now to you. I'm not quite sure where they are, what order they're going to come up, but Michael Imperioli, Ari Aster, Margaret Bodde, Rebecca Miller. If you'd like to come up and take your seats up here, that would be great. Wherever you like, I think. And then my colleague, Maddie Whittle, is going to moderate the discussion, and I'll leave it to you, Maddie. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Daniel. Thank you all so much for being with us. Thank you all for being with us. I'm incredibly excited at the prospect of this conversation. I'm curious, before we get going, who in the room was able to see Mr. Scorsese yesterday? Is it? Oh, yeah. Excellent. Okay, we won't spoil anything, or we'll try not to. But hopefully this conversation will give you a sense of what you have to look forward to when the film does make its way farther out into the world. I think that my perspective on this conversation is that I hope that you all feel encouraged to bounce off each other, and you needn't wait on me to cue you for an answer if you feel moved to express something as part of this conversation, because I think one aspect of Marty's artistry that comes through loud and clear in the film is that cinema is a conversation, and those of us who are participating in that conversation can hopefully inspire each other and draw out insights and ideas that you might not even expect at the outset of the conversation. So all that aside, I want to start with you, Rebecca, to really kick things off, since you are the mastermind behind this really monumental film portrait. It's, I describe it as a documentary, but I think the subtitle of the film is a film portrait. And I wonder if you could start by speaking about the seed or the germ of the project, what it was that inspired you to dedicate the space and the depth to this comprehensive portrait of a larger-than-life titan of cinema.
Well, honestly, it's something that kept growing. I first had an idea. I was sitting with Damon Cardesis, who's my producing partner, saying, I would love to make another documentary. And he said, who would be your favorite person? And I just said, the first person that popped into my head was Martin Scorsese. And I think the reason was it's such a rich subject. I was really interested in his Catholicism and his fascination with violence, which, how did those two things work together? I thought that his spiritual life was probably integral to his entire film life, and I thought that maybe hadn't been discussed as much as, at least I didn't know of that. So I just thought, let me call Margaret Bodde over here, because Margaret produces his documentaries. And I knew her because she had helped me with my last documentary. And so she said, first she said, oh, that's a really interesting idea. No, they're not doing it yet. No one's doing one. And
I lied.
maybe you could tell me how that happened, like what happened next? Because all I know is that you then said, write a letter, but what happened between me talking to you and that?
Well, many people wanted, many people had, been interested in, obviously Marty is this incredible GLF, greatest living filmmaker. All the reviews I've noted, it's all greatest living filmmaker, which is, I just think so wonderful. But anyway, people had been interested over the years in, trying to capture Marty's life and his work. And he was kind of not really sure. And it was always kind of like, well, maybe not. I don't know, not now. And I think when you mentioned that, I just knew he would be very intrigued by the idea of, your approach would be very artful and not like the kind of, more conventional documentaries about a filmmaker. So I think he was really intrigued, and I knew he would be really intrigued. And so, yeah, the letter is always a good first start, just to get him thinking about it. And the fact that he wasn't working at that time, it was 2020.
Well, that's right. You and I were sitting discussing whether, like, how far we had to sit away from each other. This is before we were masked. No, this is just the very beginning. And in fact, then we had the meeting, and 3 days later, everything shut down. I mean, and we, in a weird way, it was lucky that he was so bored and so stuck in his study. Because he traveled all the way upstate, did it on the porch twice for these 4-hour interviews. Those were the first interviews, and they were just, sort of self-financed. But I thought at that time that we could put this into one film. And the idea that it had to be a series really came as the editor, David Bartner, and I were working on the first part of it, and it kept growing. And we were like trying to push it back into 20 minutes. And then it was like it just didn't want to be 20 minutes. It didn't want to be 20 minutes. And finally we brought Cindy Tolan and David Cardasis, the producers, and we brought them in and we said, I think maybe this is 2 parts. And they were like, okay, well, maybe it's 2 parts. By this time, Apple had come on. And then it grew again, and it grew again. And they were so nice, and they let it grow and grow. It took a long time, so it took 5 years. But the thing, and it was really because of the titanic nature of his work. I mean, this is like, I really didn't understand, I don't think. I didn't really get how big this was going to be at the time, in the beginning.
I have to say, for anyone who hasn't seen the film, it flies by, much like a Martin Scorsese film. I think you might be surprised to see the runtime and then come out of the film and discover that it's been 5 hours, and it feels like the blink of an eye, because the subject matter is just that compelling, I think, and its presentation does justice to that. I want to sort of roll back the timeline and ask you, Rebecca, about your own acquaintance with Marty, both your acquaintance with his work and his films, and also when you first met him, and what the nature of your relationship was at the time when you approached him to embark on this project.
Well, I had fallen in love with Age of Innocence. I think I had definitely seen Goodfellas and discovered that first. That was my first Martin Scorsese movie. Then I had fallen in love with Age of Innocence and watched it twice in one night. I remember when it came out. And then gradually was educating myself in all his other films when I met him on the set of Gangs of New York, because my husband was working with him. And I was about to make a film called Personal Velocity, which I had very little money to do. And I was watching this production, which the snack budget was about the budget of my whole film. And I was very nervous. And I said to him, I have to use a lot of voiceover in my film, and I knew I was going to use voiceover. And I said, do you have any recommendations for films to watch? And of course, if you ask him that question, you're going to get a long answer. So he gave me a lot of films to watch. And I watched all these wonderful films. And I asked him later, I didn't really have any social interaction with Marty particularly, but then I asked him, would he like to see the film? And he watched the film and he gave me he just told me where his mind wandered. That was his one note. And then he watched the next couple of my films. That was sort of our only real interaction. We weren't socially that connected. And then, so that was, I wasn't somebody who knew very much about him personally. I had studied his films in my own way, through the portal really more of, I think, Age of Innocence, and then some of his films I even had to close my eyes in certain sequences. But I was really drawn to the films in a deep way, and I had a feeling about their pulse, their sort of spiritual pulse in a way. So yeah, that's how I started.
I think one of the most moving kind of motifs or thematic threads of the documentary is the way that it illustrates how seriously Marty takes the task of being a teacher, of handing over knowledge of this art form to both a younger generation of artists as well as audiences who might not have found their way into the vast canvas of cinema history. And I think I see him as a teacher. I see him as somebody who takes very seriously this task of transmission, of opening up the art to more would-be film lovers or could-be film lovers. And so I want to ask everyone on the panel sort of a similar question to what I just asked Rebecca. How did you first encounter Marty through his, presumably, first through his work, and then as a professional peer, as a mentor, as a colleague? Maybe we can loop around from Margaret, who's worked extensively with Marty as the executive director of the Film Foundation, and also in other dimensions as well.
Well, I was a huge fan. I was like a super fan, and I was in between jobs. I had worked at Miramax Films way back. This is like 100 years ago. And someone called me, John Hannity actually called me, because he had heard that Marty needed an assistant. And he said, would you want to be Martin Scorsese's assistant? I said, I would be Martin Scorsese's, like, I'd sweep the floors, like I'd do anything. I mean, at that point, I, just couldn't even imagine meeting him, So I got an interview with him, and I went up to the Met Tower. He was like on the 75th floor or something. It was crazy. A guy who's like afraid of being in planes, has this like view from like outside of a plane. Anyway, we just totally hit it off. He liked that I had gone to film school. He liked that I knew like old movies, and then I had worked at the Library of Congress, and so I had this archival thing. He said, oh, we just started this group called the Film Foundation. You can help us with that. And so then anyway, I was his assistant for a couple of years, and then there was so much work to do with the foundation that I transitioned to working, primarily on the Film Foundation, and then also producing docs. But we just share a lot of like things, humor and curiosity and a love of music, even though we have no musical ability at all. And he's just, intense and fun and complex and everything, but I'll let everyone else weigh in.
Michael, your relationship with Marty dates back to your youth in 35 years ago with Goodfellas. Your performance in that film features prominently in Mr. Scorsese. I wonder, same question for you. What was your relationship with him and his work before working with him for the first time?
I saw Raging Bull when I was 13 in the movie theater when it came in 1980, and never seen anything like it. Walking out of there, I didn't know what I experienced. It stayed with me for a really long time. It was like this old movie, that you'd watch, with your parents or something late at night on TV, but it was really modern at the same time. It was very unique. And after high school, I went to acting school. I studied with Elaine Aiken, who was Rebecca's acting teacher as well, and started studying his movies, you know, and really getting into it. And I got an audition. I'd been studying for a while. I had just started doing movies. I was 23. And I got an audition, and then I met him. And I knew he liked improv, so I did a lot of improvisation in the audition. And, you know, to be a young Italian-American New York actor, it's like being called up from the minor leagues to play with the Yankees in the World Series with De Niro and Scorsese. That was... And the thing I'll say about him is that his kindness made all of that happen for me. His kindness and compassion allowed me to feel comfortable enough with these giants to express, to feel open enough to take risks. And he said to me, I got there and he came right up to me and he said, if you have any questions, that's my trailer. You come and talk to me. You know, I'm really happy you're here. He made me feel comfortable. And he said, treat the actors like the character on and off camera, which was really good because it takes a lot of the pressure off of meeting your heroes, you know. And we had half the day to rehearse. 2 days, 2 scenes. And there's De Niro. I walk on the set. He's sitting at the card table. And I walked up to him. I said, Jimmy, what are you drinking? And he went, a shot of scotch and a glass of water. And Marty made me feel so comfortable that I said to him, why don't I reset all the props on the card table, which is the prop guy's job, and it's a very specific continuity issue. And he's like, yeah, that's a good idea. Let the kid he's going to reset all the, and I would never do that today, you know. I don't know, it was him making me feel comfortable. And then the bar where Spider makes the drinks, the bar was turned away from the table. I said, no, we got to put the bar here. Now I'm doing props and set decoration. We got to put the bar here and the bottle so when I'm making drinks, I can watch these guys because that's my job. He's like, yeah, that's good. Move the thing around. And there was only one line written for the second scene when he tells Tommy to fuck off. But all those scenes are just improv every time. And, you know, I had done my first movie the year before with a really big director, and it was horrendous. He was impatient, he was stressed out, and he made me feel horrible. And I was pretty much cut completely the opposite. You know, that kindness and, you know, you can be the greatest technician and craftsman, which he happens to be anyway, but that doesn't mean you can work with actors. It's a completely different thing, you know. I'll tell one very brief, hilarious thing that happened. And then, now I have to do the second day this scene when he gets shot, and now they had a stunt double. I said, no, I'm gonna do the stunt. So now I'm the stunt man too, right? He said, good, that's good. Okay, it's not that complicated. I get squibbed up, 3 squibs. I go back into the bar. He goes, we'll pad you up. And so we do the scene, you know, the first take, I walk over with the drink. Joe Pesci starts shooting me. The squibs go off and I hit the ground. The prop guy forgot to put a fake glass. When I hit the ground, the glass broke, splitting open, cutting open 2 of my fingers. Marty goes, cut, everybody freeze, nobody move. He saw what happened. I'm on the ground, you know, De Niro's looking down, he sees all this blood, he's like, you know, grossed out. Marty's like, you gotta go to the hospital. The production assistant takes me to the hospital. We go into the emergency entrance, and the whole staff is flipping out. And I'm going, yeah, I'm in a movie with Robert De Niro, I cut my fingers. They're like, code blue, they bring out a stretcher, they don't, and I'm like, no, I'm an actor. And they're like, yes, sure, you're in. And I realize I have 3 bullet holes in my chest. They think I'm about to drop dead. I'm talking about Robert De Niro, you know? So they cut open the shirt and they see the squibs and they said, oh, I said, I told you I'm doing a movie. They're like, okay, have a seat. We'll get to it. And 3 hours later, they stitch me up. I go back and do 3 more takes. And I told Marty what happened. He was hysterical. And he said, you're going to tell that story on The Tonight Show, which actually wound up happening years later. But that's the take that you see in the movie is that first one where, and you know, when you get initiated into the mafia, they prick your finger and put it on the saint. So I cut my finger on this mob movie with these guys who were So that was, but his kindness and compassion probably gave me a career, basically.
I think that kindness and compassion is also something that comes through so clearly in the film, as well as this openness and that he seems to have in working with other artists and taking on ideas and contributions that, I don't, the film very much conveys the sense that he is not a dictator who is imposing his authorial will on a set, even as much as he is a visionary auteur who is true to his vision at every step. He's also open to the ideas and contributions of the 23-year-old who is new to film sets, but has the passion and the focus to be able to lock into his existing vision and bring something more out of it. And I think, knowing something of his relationship with his peers in the industry, his fellow filmmakers, I have the sense that he confers that same respect to other artists, which brings me to you, Ari, because I, not to interject my own voice too much into the conversation, but I recall at the last time that Marty was at NYFF in 2019, he did a talk with Kent Jones about his work on The Irishman, and I believe showed a clip from Hereditary. Is that right? I know he discussed your work. And it was, witnessing the excitement that he had for taking in the vision of other filmmakers who are doing work very different from his, but again, part of the same conversation, was very moving to me at the time. And I'm curious if you could speak about, again, your relationship with his work, but perhaps even more what his feedback has meant to you as a fellow artist.
Well, first I just want to say I really love the film, and I think Rebecca did a really beautiful job. It's really, I mean, I feel this way being on this panel. Do I have any special insight to offer on the most venerated, most discussed, most beloved filmmaker? And I feel like you really got at stuff that I hadn't seen or read before, and that it feels essential, which is huge because there's probably more written on him than any living filmmaker, and I do think he's the greatest living filmmaker. I mean that I don't know that. That experience, I was in the theater when that happened at Alice Tully, and that was obviously very meaningful to me because that's how I feel about him. I think he's the greatest living filmmaker, and when I was a kid, I wanted to. I mean, I don't know. You can't be Martin Scorsese, so it's like you can't do that. Nobody's ever done that. That body of work is actually kind of hard to even look at. Because it's diminishing. It's holy shit. It's really singular what he's achieved. Not only just the amount of great films he's made, but I mean the fact that he just keeps persisting. I mean if you look at the last 15 years or the last decade, Wolf of Wall Street, Silence, Irishman, Killers of the Flower Moon, and he's in his 80s. Fuck off. Just really some of the greatest films ever made. And they're so alive. They're teeming with life in a way that's instructive, but also, again, intimidating as a filmmaker. But as a kid, I mean, I agree with you. I've always looked at him as a teacher. And he is this paternal, he's the paternal figure in American cinema, but he's also a dutiful son. He's a good, it's amazing to have this guy who's distinguished himself more than anybody in film, and then at the same time he's done more for film preservation and for the history of cinema. And then, like, for instance, I'm just one of many, many filmmakers that he's been kind to, you know? And, you know, so it's very, yeah, he's amazing. And so what is my experience? Yeah, I don't know. Just as a kid, the first one I saw was Goodfellas. I saw it when I was like 11. And at that point, I knew that I wanted to devote my life to film, but that was the first. But I think I wanted to be an actor because it's like, that's what you see. It's like, I want to be in a movie. And then with Goodfellas, it's like, what's going on here? What's different about this? Why does this not feel like other films? And then you know, it's part of cinephilia. You like a movie, you like read about it, you like watch an interview. And he has always been so generous about talking about his influences. And I remember, you know, oh, I love Goodfellas. Okay, let me go deeper. It's like, okay, he's talking about Max O'Fools. He's talking about, I mean, in any given movie, he's talking, you know, about a lot of filmmakers, and you go into those, and then you watch, you know, Taxi Driver, and you listen to him, and okay, he's talking about Pickpocket. Who's Bresson? Okay, I'm gonna dig there. Talks about Godard because and so you move into Godard, and then, you know, talks about Cassavetes, Rossellini. So he kind of brought me into, more than any other filmmaker, he kind of led me to film history, and it grew from there, and it you know, it's my whole life. But he's done that for so many people. Yeah.
Something that you said, Ari, about sort of the surprise at the fact that it's possible to continue illuminating new sides of this figure who I think we all feel that we know through his films and through the interviews he's done. He's not a recluse. He's very open and eager to talk about his films. But I think that there's something in Mr. Scorsese that is new and that is very vividly, specifically showing us a side of him, or maybe many sides of him that we haven't seen before. And I think part of it's the expansiveness and the scope of it, but also the intimacy of it, and the fact that we can hear some of your questions that you're asking him and feel your presence makes it feel that much more intimate and that much more conversational. So could you just speak a little bit about how you approach this challenge of immensity and sort of novelty?
The spine of the whole thing is this conversation, which happened over a span of 5 years. But there's ultimately we spoke for about 20 hours. So there would be these conversations that would last 5 hours sometimes. I remember once we just literally lost the light because I realized at a certain point that it was much better if everyone left the room. So I would let the crew leave the room and set up the cameras, and then they would leave. And it would really feel like we were alone. And as time would go on, we really did forget. I mean, in fact, the framing was crazy. Like sometimes he ended up at the bottom of the frame, and we had to do a lot of adjustments. But it was worth it because there was just something. He decided, I think, to honor this thing that he decided to do with a certain kind of honesty and an openness and an unwillingness to kind of tread the ground that he'd already tread. He really wanted to till new earth, I guess, and I think that was so that was always the backbone, and then everything came from those conversations, like all my archival dives and all my searches and all this stuff, and of course, because I wanted it to be that. I mean, Marty really became. Him as a filmmaker happened so young in his life. I mean, I would even say like when he was 9 or something. You know, I mean, he was. That you can't take the filmmaker out of the man, and you can't take the man out of the filmmaker. Those two things are together. So how the dance between those two, it's like two things that are having a tango. You can't, and my rule was that, you know, whatever film we discuss, somehow it had to have a connection, a visceral connection to him as a person, that like you could sort of see those two things. So it would never become a list, if that makes sense, of accomplishments, but rather you're with him in a visceral way as he lives his life and the crises that he has, you know, because I feel like I've spoken to a few people, I mean, you included, just watching it, that in a way it's encouraging to watch the Times. I mean, he's like left for dead by the industry, or has these terrible, so many very difficult things happen, and he had to reinvent himself and so on. But I would say that, like, really for me, the Bible was the conversations, and the way I approached the conversations was by completely listening and then following, but not, I had lists of the films that I needed to talk about, but I didn't really have an agenda. I was just really following, and so it was a kind of a stream of consciousness in a way, I guess.
And I think from the start of the film through the entire 5 hours, you foreground the way in which his films are in conversation with his own cinephilia and his own love of the medium and of the great artists who've come before him. And I'm curious if that was something that you that he contributed to the way in which you built out this sort of relationship between his influences and his work and the younger generations who he has influenced.
Well, I mean, like what you were saying about, he mentioned something, you watch it, and that was happening constantly. I really feel like I kind of went to graduate school, which I never did, but I mean, by listening to him, watching the films, and I had already tried to watch as many films as I could that I felt he had influenced him, so I would be ready with these conversations, but there's always more that you can learn. I mean, it's like, it's a bottomless pit. I mean, it's insane, and he remembers them shot by shot almost, too. So, yeah. One thing I was curious, if you don't mind, I was just curious if, if you related, because it's such an interesting combination of him being so prepared, but also so open. And I was just find that mind-blowing. And I was just wondering if you also feel that way.
Prepared.
Prepared in terms of as a filmmaker, he's totally prepared. And yet it's yet he blows it all up.
Well, you have to be open if the movie's going to get beyond you, and it has to get beyond you if it's going to be just interesting and not stiff and wooden.
Yeah.
One thing, just thinking about again his influences that I think is notable is he is so influenced by other filmmakers. He's taken everything in. He has this really capacious, to use one of his words, vocabulary, right? But he never uses them in a way that's self-conscious. It's he's metabolized all these films and all these things, and and there's never anything precious about his films, but they're also extremely they're just very sophisticated. But I'm going back to that thing I said about all those films he led me to. There's something about the way that he's devoured everything, and the way that it's settled into his bones, that just makes it so that, and his interest, his curiosity in so many things. I think that's why he's still making these really vital films at a very,
I remember the first time I met him was actually maybe it wasn't the first time I met him, but I remember seeing him on the set of Gangs of New York, and he was about to shoot that big scene where there's the big battle scene, and and he was so nervous, and I thought, what? I can't believe he's so nervous. He was so unsure, or maybe not unsure, but just alive with this sort of sense of danger that the whole thing could go to crap, that he was really gonna, and I remember thinking what a young man. What a young person. He was just completely, alive.
I was just going to weigh in because Marty is so young. It's you were talking about him making Wolf of Wall Street. He was in his late 70s or something. It's he's so youthful. He's more energy. I always thought I would catch up as we aged. I was oh, well, once he gets older, I'll be able to keep up with him. I still can't keep up with him. I mean, he is literally energy. There's just something, his mind, his, spirit, everything, his intellectual curiosity. And, when you guys are talking about he's making films and he's working all the time and he's reading and he's developing the next project, and interspersed with all of that, he is obsessively doing the work of preserving cinema, world cinema around the world, it's amazing to me. Like, I have the Jennifer Ahn and myself, who run the Film Foundation, we have the like kind of just most glorious situation where, like, anytime I have news, like I had to talk to him recently about Sonochrome Kodak film with Sign of the Cross, this Cecil B. DeMille film, and it was this printing stock that Kodak had developed for like films in the late 20s through the 30s, and it would tint your film a certain color, and it's this amazing color wheel with all these different, like, violet and fleur-de-lis and candle flame was the color. It was like this amber golden hue. And so I got to, I said, they're restoring the film and they want to make sure that, it should be restored in candle flame. And he sent me this text and he was like, candle flame, with like 6 exclamation points. And it's like, he wants to, like, be a part. It's like a way of being part of the whole of cinema, because he's saving it. And it's something that has been consistent in the 34 years I've known him. He just always makes time. He spends like time every day, like, doing something for cinema, which is, I think, first of all, incredibly inspirational, but it's for people who, work with him when you're making a movie and he's telling you to, like, he screens things for his cast and production team that are going to make a movie. He screens films from the past. It's this very alive dialogue that he has with films that have been made from the beginning of time.
I worked a couple of years after Goodfellas. I worked as an assistant to the woman who was running his development branch in the Brill Building, and one of my jobs was movies. Then, I don't know if it's still the same, were released on Wednesday and Thursday in New York, in the theaters. This is like 1990. So I'd have to go through all the major newspapers, the Post, the Times, the New, and the Village Voice, and cut out reviews of every single review of every movie that came out on those days and put it in like this big album, because he wanted to be aware of everything that was coming out all the time. And, like what you were saying, the movie that you made, is very he's still such a fan. And it's not locked into the golden age or the old days. He's still like a fan of movies. Of young artists as well. That's really unique. And that thirst for knowing, he also, the other aspect of my job, his video collection was there in the Brill Building, which was huge. It was like a video store. And a lot of journalists and filmmakers would borrow from Marty. He had the most extensive video collection, back then. That was VHS. Again, that's just a testament to how much he just loves this art form.
And Marty would tape movies off of television, and it was VHS and it was Betamax, and those tapes I would borrow. I mean, when I started working in 1991 for him, and I would see that he had a film of, he'd mention a film, A Kid for Two Farthings or something, and I'd be like, I've never seen that film. So I'd borrow the tape, and it would be cut with these, like, car commercials in between, and because it was just off of New York City television, and it was just this kind of, like, I just imagine him like someone had to program like every film. He'd go through the schedules of what was on television, and he'd circle everything, and someone's job was to, like, record all that for him. And then that collection happily is at the University of Colorado Boulder now.
Isn't that what Ken Jones, didn't Ken Jones do
Ken
that?
started working for Marty,
Yeah.
and he was his video archivist. That was like a job, and you had to be like, you had to be someone who knew cinema, because otherwise you'd be like this dope, like you had to kind of have some kind of ability to take in what he wanted, from these films, and to be able to, when he had questions about that, you'd have to know something. But and when I first started working for him, he was collecting posters and film prints and it was almost like to the level of like you'd meet some guy in Central Park with a bag of cash, like it was kind of like a little bit of a continuation of the 70s. It was like this very obsessive thing of like, had to have this film print, and it had to be the IB Tech, even if it was 16 millimeter, and it was just, he just is, like capacious is the word. He's just, it's a never ending cycle of kind of almost like renewing his energy, and it's Steven Spielberg says it in the film, there'll never be another Martin Scorsese. Like literally, he's just the most extraordinary human being.
Michael, I'm curious if the cinephilia that we're I think all appreciating in this conversation, was an explicit presence on his set when you were an actor being directed by him, or was it more just sort of ambient?
When I auditioned, all the actors got segments of the script for Joe Pesci's character, Tommy. So I actually thought I was auditioning for Joe Pesci's character, right? And I guess everybody did, because you didn't get the script, you didn't know who you were, what the character was, you just had these sides. And he mentions in the scene something of the Cincinnati Kid or some other movie, and then so I did the scene, and I did that line or whatever, and he went, he said it in the script, the Cincinnati Kid, but it's really not that movie. It's, he mentioned some other, like, it's really Shane, and it's not, and like as if I would know that too. This very obscure reference to this Western that I had no idea what he was talking about, but he wanted to make sure that, to set the record straight, that I was aware that somebody made a misreference there. The character's making a misreference, not accurate to cinema history, but he wanted to make sure I knew that. I had no idea what he was talking about.
One of my favorite aspects of the documentary, as sort of a lifelong student of Hollywood history and how the industry works, is how in tandem with the sort of narrative of his artistry, his philosophy and sensibility as an artist, we see or hear the story of navigating an industry over half a century as a fiercely, from day one, independent-minded artist who wanted to tell the stories that he was driven to tell, and had to navigate sort of the historical and economic currents that shaped the fates of this industrial art form. And I think it's it's almost a master class, the film, in how to assert your own vision as an artist. And I'm curious, Rebecca, if that was sort of a guiding principle of the story that you wanted to tell about Marty, or was that sort of just inextricable from the story of the art?
Well, I wanted very much to go macro, micro all the time, so that you could understand the periods that he was living through and how the sort of historical or art historical, what was going on was influencing him, what was possible in the 70s, but then what was possible in the 80s, and then what happens in the 90s, and so on. But what's amazing to me about him is he's such a personal artist, but yet his art leapt into the public sphere and took hold of people's consciousnesses in so many times. Like, in The Last Temptation of Christ, the protests, when you see the film, the protests were like, it was like the world exploded with rage at a film they hadn't seen yet, but the idea of that film, and it really became a huge problem. Taxi Driver, what happened with Hinckley, it's like he had a kind of contagion in his films. There's something, it's really remarkable. So he didn't stay as small and personal. And part of that, for that to happen, he needed these people in his life. He met certain people. He meets, Henry Winkler, he meets Henry Winkler, yeah. He meets Mike Ovitz. He meets, Rick Yorn. There are these characters that without which, he needs these big guys who are going to find a way of giving him this money so that he can paint on these big canvases, And it's really interesting tracing when he loses the capacity, and when he's lost his angels, and when he encounters somebody and they sort of save him. It's very interesting because it's the story of many kind of falling downs and then many rescues. And a lot of that has to do with the strength of his personality and how he has something innately lovable, I guess, about him, but also he knows how, and they talk about this in the documentary, he also knows how to talk to men of power, people of power, partly because of where he came from. And, you know, which was, again, one of the reasons that I needed to spend so long in the neighborhood, you know, with understanding just the geometry of the streets of Little Italy at that time, you know, and what was going on.
I want to say that aspect of the film, his family and his friends from the neighborhood. I mean, I've known him so long. He was so open with you and so, you know, just he had never talked about any of that stuff or a lot of that stuff, right? I mean, maybe he'd talk about it privately, but the fact that he's willing to, at this stage of his life, I think, right, become, you know, just I mean, he's honest and he's expressing a lot of pain from his childhood and a lot of vulnerability. And I think that his mother and her influence on him, I mean, she was just the most incredible person, and her love and adoration of him, I think, is kind of this, it is part of him. You know.
I love this, the moment where he's on the set of Taxi Driver and his mom is sitting in the director's chair. It's just such a great combination, you know.
Building on all of this, I'm curious to you, Ari, as a similarly independent-minded artist who has blazed a trail for yourself in the industry. Have you consciously seen the example that Marty has set and tried to emulate his relation to his both the industrial forces at work around him, but also any number of the forces that he's juggling that we're talking about, the influences that are shaping the choices that he gets to make and does make?
Well, there are certain filmmakers that I would describe as like liberating influences, people whose work kind of like allows you to like shake off some of the rules that I think you get like saddled with as you get going, and I don't know. I mean, I have a I don't like prescriptive art. I don't I like difficult work. But his work, I would say, growing up, like it so many of those films were like lightning bolts for me. Taxi Driver, Age of Innocence, King of Comedy. I mean, all of them. But especially the ones that like didn't like were not only okay with alienating the audience, but like it's what does the movie need? There's nothing calculated about his films, and that's the thing that I think not only, you know, was instructive to me growing up, but is something that I kind of go back to him to remind myself, like, yeah, that's right. And you know, as somebody who has made a couple films that, like, you know, were divisive, it's helpful to like remember, oh right, King of Comedy like wasn't received well, like what? Age of Innocence was disappointing, like was it? Like, you know, you know, even New York to me is like such a fucking exciting, playful, experimental, beautiful film. It's so much more valuable than some perfect little trinket. And so, you know, I would, yeah, and I don't know. Well, maybe just one thing that is maybe, I'm not sure. My first two films were more well received than my second two, and I think part of why that is because I kind of didn't like the reception of the first two somehow. Now I really don't like the reception of the second two.
You want to go back to the first
But
one.
I watching this yesterday, you know, it was like really soothing to me. Like, yeah, it's heartbreaking to release a film. It's heartbreaking when it goes well because it's not yours anymore, and even the way people talk about it, it's like you don't recognize it. It's just not. There's something very alienating about it. It's very lonely, and then there's something really devastating when it's not quite what you were hoping. And so it's just useful to remember that some of these films that are, you know, just they've now been canonized and they're now undeniable. But like, where the fuck were the critics then? I don't know. It's just anyway.
No, there's that great story. So Marty made Who's That Knocking at My Door, and then he got this deal to do this Roger Corman produced movie called Boxcar Bertha, and then he showed Boxcar Bertha to Cassavetes, who had seen Who's That Knocking and loved it. And Cassavetes watched the movie and said to Marty, "You just wasted a year of your life on a piece of shit." This was his big thing in Hollywood, right? You know, his second film, and he said, "You shouldn't be doing stuff like this. Do you have something that means something to you that is personal?" And Marty, that was Mean Streets, and then his next movie was Mean Streets. But that was such a big, maybe being that brutally honest with someone and saying, "You just wasted a year of life on a piece of shit." And I think Marty,
That's a good friend.
that's a good friend,
That's a
right?
good
And I think
friend.
he probably keeps that and tries
He
to
cared
also.
so much about him, you know, and he had loved his first film so much, I think,
Yeah.
you know, and he just was like, you can't. And what's fascinating is that Jay says, so he abandoned it, because we have that story in the film, and he says, Jay Coxon says, so he abandoned his plans to make, you know, Escape from Devil's Island.
Right.
So this was going to be like his, you know, he was going to go on in this vein.
Right, exactly.
Apparently. But,
Well, and the times when Marty was a young filmmaker and he was, you know, fired. I mean, it was devastating for him. Fired off of
yeah, he was fired off
Honeymoon
of Honeymoon
Killers,
Killers.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
and
really?
That was his
he
first
was,
feature.
and it was like, you know, you look back and you think like, okay, that's like the hand of fate or something. You know, I mean, he. It was very. I mean, that's in the film too. Is that idea of like how does a genius, sensitive person navigate himself so well in the horrors of, like, you know, the Hollywood industry, knowing, I think, as a young person where he wanted to go, right? And so when people would meet him and not immediately let him make a movie, or
Well, it's
not
important to
immediately
remember
get
that it's not.
Yeah.
It wasn't inevitable, right? It was.
Yeah.
It seems so now,
Right.
but it wasn't then. He didn't know he was ever going to break through, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and the pain and the horror of that he may never get there. You really feel it as he tells it.
Yeah, yeah. And then it's also interesting, this dialogue that he has between nonfiction and his fiction films,
Yeah.
because I think they really are important to each other. And, you know, he's making Italian American after he makes Mean Streets, right? I mean, he's all from the jump, you know, it's cinema to him. It's storytelling, right?
Yeah.
So then American Boy and Last Waltz, and it's just like it's almost kind of like those nonfiction films still allow him the ability to, like, not have to worry about the big budget, and he's just able to really, I mean, I've seen it happen where he just has this impulse and he just takes that impulse. He says, we got to make a movie about that. You know, it's like David Johansen is singing at Cafe Carlisle and Marty sees it and he's like, yeah, we just got to document that. And we're like, okay.
I was there that night.
You were there that night?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Sitting right behind him.
Really?
Yeah. And then
it's-
David sat with him after, and they were
Yeah.
hanging out.
And it's just this kind of like, I want to do this, and then he tasks,
But
you know.
also, it was
how
like
do you
one
do
of the
that?
things that Nick Pileggi says is he was always saying like what really happened. And Tedeschi also said that, like, but that he's always interested in this anthropology aspect of like whatever world he's exploring. So it's kind of makes sense too that he's so connected to documentary in that way, you know, like what really happened.
I've gotten the signal that we're almost out of time, but I want to just wrap up this beautiful conversation. Rebecca, asking you about making a film about this master filmmaker, and whether it was whether you had conversations about the very film that you were making in the process of making it. Did he have input into the project, or did he sort of fall back into the role of subject and allow you to make the story what you wanted it to be?
I think he knew that if he started getting involved, there would be no end to it for him. So he just said, I like your films. I think I'll just see what happens. Like, you know, he was like, I don't know what you're doing. And he would occasionally, you know, I would fill him in that it's now 5 episodes instead of one piece of work, you know, that kind of thing. But he then watched it when it was, he asked about 3/4 of the way through, I offered to show it to him where we were. And he said, well, let me see a transcript. So we made this really elaborate transcript of the whole, every single image and every piece of music that was, and every image. So he could basically read the film. And he had some notes there. He's like, no, Thelma's wrong. It was like, you know, this wasn't, whatever. It was all informational. And then I showed it to him when it was really finished, and it hadn't been, well, it was finished, yeah. And he had, again, a few informational things, but he basically, you know, and it was hard for him to watch it. I think it was painful in some ways to watch it, and exciting. But I mean, in the end, he said he thought it was well made, and that was like the great compliment for me. So, but he really let me make the film. I think that was probably the only way he could do it.
Well, I think the results speak for themselves. It's a film that speaks for itself, and I hope that those of you who haven't had a chance to see it yet will go out and catch it as soon as you possibly can.